nossa mesa de migrações
This is our panel on migrations. So I'm going to introduce our participants in a minute. Firstly, I want to say, before we go into the panel itself, during the whole period of our panel, you can access the Q&A to ask your questions or raise your hand to ask questions orally. And also, I want to let everyone know that we have simultaneous translation. So you can go to the globe at the bottom of your screen or the three dots that say more when you're if you're on your phone or tablet. So just that initial housekeeping. So firstly, I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to introduce myself and tell you all a little bit about our panel. So this is the international migrations, human rights violations, and transnational corporations. My name is Barbara Dybert. I am an associate professor of the Federal University of Juiz de Fora. I'm from comparative literature. I was the international relations director of the institution in the last 5 years, and I work with cultural studies, comparative literature, diaspora literature, and the question of silence. I had the honor and the pleasure of being part of HOMA this year. I started a dialogue, a debate, transdisciplinary debate with colleagues from other areas, particularly from IR and law, with whom I have much to exchange and there's much to grow mutually. So I'm very happy to be here as the coordinator of this line of research, and I hope we have a good seminar. So I'm going to read out a text of introduction, okay? We've always been in movement since the beginning of human existence, and when Homo sapiens understood that they'd have to move to survive, we've faced the challenge of crossing lands and seas, deserts, with the promise of a promised land beyond Mount Sinai. Along the way, with maps that redesigned themselves, we stepped on glaciers where we were able to cross the world from the mother continent, Africa, to America, crossing forests, savannas, with gatherings and fights along the way that resulted in a multi-plural and rich panel of human beings of the contemporary world, where the idea of racial purity all the way from the caves has always been an impossibility. When we talk about international migrations, corporations, and human rights in 2021, it's not just a movement that we're talking about. We're talking about a crisis, the biggest in all of the contemporary era that carries in itself the drama of separated families, uprooted, deterritorialized, the sentiment of homelessness, the loss of the home that we're eternally condemned to seek without success. Along the way, the home was altered by others, foreigners and strangers that here in my motherland arrived after me, or I was the one who came from a motherland and I'm no longer able to recognize, neither in exile nor when I occasionally return, because the experience of migration has altered me. The migrant, this frightful being in movement, a bridge between worlds, and a point of contact with alterity whose existence I don't always want to remember, opens windows to the perception that I've never been alone, and the limits that define me are not so shut as I intended them to be. In the current world, the number of migrants keeps growing, and we need to talk about this crisis, the hybrid place where they are, and the priorities of an economic system that we created and that has become bigger than us, uglier than we wanted, and worse than what we dreamed. The horror of Conrad, inhabited by the stranger of Freud, that sentiment of fright, which is a familiar sentiment that takes us over when we recognize and don't recognize any longer our own motherland, because as Kafka would say, even when we're home, the fact is that we're always in someone else's home. To take the example, the most recent example, we can see the videos of the migrants on the Poland-Belarus Belarus border. The images are shocking because to make your life fit into two backpacks, to cross the world to a place where you're not welcome, shouldn't be anybody's life project. In this case, in the specific case, the last destination aimed for by those migrants is perhaps Germany, the heart of the European Union, that nobody knows how will continue to absorb the immigrants, especially from the Middle East, that are hiding in the cold forests of Poland and trying to cross the barbed wire fences. Germany fears xenophobia that is still alive and latent with the recent trauma, but will be unable to solve a problem of this proportion or to absorb all those fleeing authoritarian governments and humanitarian crises in the Middle East. For their part, the British think that they've solved the question of the crisis by leaving the European Union, but they're also full of citizens from their former colonies, from their former empire where the sun never sets. For colonialism has its consequences. Over here on this side of the Atlantic, the cages continue to exist on the Mexico-US border, now with less media attention, but El Paso continues to be a place that is tense and full of rancor for those that are called the dirty ones. The multiple examples are spread out, but we're only at the start of the crisis that should become enhanced in the current century, that is likely to become enhanced to the point that the borders of the Northern Hemisphere and of the West will have to be defended or reconfigured. From one way or another, it will be the biggest war, symbolic or not, of the contemporary world. According to the latest survey of the UN, in the International Migration 2020 Highlights report formulated by the Department of Economic and Social Matters of the UN, the global number of international migrants reached 281 million last year. 10 years ago, it was 221 million, which means that the number of international migrants grew more quickly than the world population in this century, representing today in absolute numbers almost the number of the inhabitants of Indonesia, which is the fourth most populous country in the world. In this report, we read that the number of people dislocated across international borders, fleeing conflicts, persecution, violence, or human rights violations, has doubled from 17 to 34 million in the last 20 years. The crisis, in fact, is deepening and may be drawn on the world map. It comes in a wave that is south-north and east-west. So much so that 2/3 of all international migrants live in just 20 countries. The highlight being the United States, that continue to be the preferential destination with 51 million migrants, 18% of the total of the population, Germany with 16 million, and the UK with 9. Although the human experience of dislocation existed, of movement existed since prehistory, it has reached numbers never before imagined and has become the greatest crisis of the current setting. It's urgent to ask, what did we do or what did we fail to do to motivate hundreds of people to put their lives into two backpacks and trying to cross a forest in a very cold Polish winter with children and elderly on their arms? What makes people, millions of people, crossing the desert, being transported by coyotes, or risk having a son drown on the Mediterranean Sea? In this 8th seminar, the first in which we can participate with a panel specific for the migration research line, more than answers, we need to ask questions. So we will use what we always have been able to do, which is movement. So let us move ourselves towards each other by listening and by dialogue in search of the question: how has the system failed? What mistake have we made? And hopefully, along the way to an answer, maybe we can extend a hand of solidarity to those that are side by side with us, who also seek a map in which paths may be always recreated. Okay, so in this opening moment, I would like to introduce now, firstly, thank everyone for coming, and I'd like to introduce our guests. We have very busy people here today who left their schedules aside to join us here and share a little bit about this question, this spirit of walking together. So, Professor Juan Hernandez Subizarreta, he holds a PhD in law from the University of the Basque Country, professor of company law in the same university, member of the Center for the Studies of International Cooperation and Development. He has written several books and articles about various questions related to corporations and the crisis of regulatory systems. So the corporation with responsibility and that's one of his books. And he's a coordinator of the Permanent Court of the People. So I'm very glad to introduce Professor Juan Hernandez Zubizarreta, who now has the floor. Thank you, Barbara. I want to thank my colleagues from HOMA for the invitation, because I'm very pleased for the invitation, and I want to greet my colleagues and all the participants. I'm going to present my talk with a few key ideas, 5, and the aim is to establish, let's say, a conceptual framework about the relations between corporate power and forced migrations. So forgive me for this methodology. I'm going to do my best to stay within the 15 minutes, and also try to respect the interpreters by not being too speedy. So forced migrations put us before a very tough question about the destruction of the international system of human rights. This is a tough statement to start off with, because international human rights law is not only fragile, has been made to become fragile, but is entering a new phase of destruction, which requires a rapid intervention to put the brakes on that process. So the first idea is to relate forced migrations with the systemic crisis or the crisis of domination that the capitalist system is undergoing right now, as if we had a chain with various steps, rather a chain with various links. And so this chain is surrounding uh, refugees and migrants and is submerging their rights, making their rights drown. So the capitalist model is having it, finding it difficult to keep the rate of accumulation and profits high for the elites. It's a crisis in the post-pandemic has become sharper with price increases, so the deficiencies of the global supply chains. So it is a crisis of accumulation, a very strong one.
There's a system of the financial system that does not produce anything, does not position itself. And there's a number of other obstacles that are called the hidden enemies of capitalism. We have environmental problems, and also we are in a neo-colonial system. So this chain, as we said, the elites, the capital, to keep their high level of profits, they radicalize their practices against human rights, peoples, and nature. To take this at two streams, we see how migrant people suffer with the model that understand them as people that do not produce, they do not consume, and therefore they are human waste. So we have the idea of putting these people aside, letting them to die. Some of these people are imprisoned, others are explored in the labor market of richer countries. And this is the first point. The second is how the corporate power acts against human rights to different streams. Are three basic mechanisms. First, there's a deep democratic crisis, which is now seen as a global trend. We can speak of a neoliberal authoritarianism in the frontier of post-fascist spaces, with the extreme right-wing growing, and the deficiency of democracy can be evidenced by 3 points. First, democratic institutions, the classic democratic institutions, are suffering a deep disruption. The state of law, the separation of powers, and judicial authoritarianism. They no longer protect citizenship and even less migrant people. The judicial protection no longer exists, and we have the emergence of a global economic constitution that is not formalized by any text, that constitutes a number of different rules in forms of contracts, court sentences, and different standards that are interweaved and overlap each other, leading to profound damages to the democratic systems and their institutions. And finally, we have the architecture of impunity, very strong power belonging on the hands of corporations, aiming at destruction, not only weakening, but destruction of rights of millions of people. And we are talking about migrant people. The fragility of the democratic systems used by the elites show structural violence that could be called also a war of the richest against the poor that enters now a new phase, a phase that is established within this wave of power, with a long wave of violence against people that are forced to displace themselves, to dislodge themselves. And the pedagogy of domination, the values that the elites use to dominate the poor, the hegemony of crunch puts us in complex situations of the value of domination, the patriarchal family, the extreme poverty, that there is not enough for everyone, the idea that we must defend ourselves from migrant people. They are terrorists, they steal from us, and these are the ideas of the extreme right that disseminate this idea. This, but the Declaration of a Human Right is being replaced by the Declaration of the Corporate Power. So the trade of lives wins at this moment. Everything can be sold, everything can be bought, everything is under the law of offer and demand, exploitation, private property as a central volume, an inequality that is part of the normative hierarchy, institutionalized racism, applying strongly to migration wars with neocolonialism, that gender division of labor adjusted by the juridical ordinance. So we have the second idea of the mechanisms used by the elite in this devaluation of democracy. And the third idea that I want to refer to is this is a snapshot that Barbara described well, the snapshot of the horrors, million and million of people that are um, displaced, traveling around the world, and the dramatic snapshot in which the a pain is something that we cannot forget. Unfortunately, I don't have much time left, and this is an academic um, event, but I want to describe the pain of all of these people that cannot count on justice. They are dying in the middle of deserts, in the oceans, on the borders. This is a is a necropolitics. They are allowing, they are letting these people to die. This fragmenting their rights. There are specific treatments for certain groups. There are walls, there are borders, mass deportations, criminalization of solidarity, concentration camps. The hardships of colonial procedures, a division of society between people that can be assimilated and people that will be exterminated. So it leads us to reaffirm how human rights were set aside, where we prioritize corporate practices. Human rights are being emptied by processes of enriching the riches, and I'd like to refer to the four idea, the complete reconfiguration of human rights, especially those who are forced to migrate. So we see this reconfiguration that is something that can be established in three different categories. First, the precariness, not only precarious labor relations, but also precarious rights. This is part of the core of the establishment of different relationships. If we see labor relationships in, for example, the Spanish law, which is extreme racist, that establish as a priority jobs for domestic citizens and putting migrants in a juridical limbus. So these people become object of exploitation for the dominant classes in the countries that receive them. This is a hard reality, but it exists. Through regulation, is the lack of regulation is a trend around all the planet. So we see a lot of indigenous communities being expelled from their own lands, workers that are expelled from their labor environments because capitalism, metabolism need natural resources, and the military industry, the oil industry, mining, the agribusiness, the tourism business, they go to these places and they have to expel these people, creating this displacement. This is connected to a slave work in creating a historical moment for millions of peoples. When people, for example, in the African continent were removed from their territory and became part of the capitalism system. And we, in terms of necropolitics, we don't, and we can use different words for it: necro borders, necro capitalism, necro politics. Death is entering the constitution of the system, and this is the idea of those who do not produce or do not consume. They are good for nothing, so they become a human waste. This people is left to die. And this is central to this new configuration. After the Second World War, uh, we see that human rights are being destroyed. People need their rights, to have their rights established. They, these people, they become infrahuman. This reminds us of other historical movements that must be considered. And we are now in this point of reconfiguration. Many people that are forced to leave their territories so that capitalism can continue to work. They're exposed to necropolities, some are left to die, others can reach other lands and are forced to live in refugee camps or concentration camps. Others that can enter new countries are then exploited in illegal and forced ways, submitted to juridical void. So I want to say that we are now in a moment where we have new migrants that travel globally with fragmented identities, fragmented and different identities, and they need protection for their rights. These people need an expanded juridical protection. So both in Geneva protection that must be complied with and respected. It's at least in the European community, the Geneva Protocol is not respected. And also the Convention for Migrants that must be ratified, the neoliberal theory that the person migrates to work voluntarily is false. The persecution persecution of these people should be banned. We need a new juridical framework that protects these people and transition. So we must reinterpret the reading of these rights and build a new juridical network that works from bottom up. It's intolerable that these people are subject to a juridical void because the interests of domination do not correspond to the majority of people. So it's essential to recover the essential sense of these human rights. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You were very inspiring. It's the second time that I have the opportunity to hear you. And I feel very honored to be able to hear your words. And now we are going to have our second speaker, Professor André Carvalho Ramos. Professor André is a professor in the School of Law of the University of São Paulo and full professor in the graduate studies in the Autonomous School of Law of University of São Paulo. He's a doctor in international law from the School of Law of University of São Paulo and was visiting fellow in the International Law School in Cambridge. He is a regional attorney, national coordinator of the Working Group Immigration and Refugee. So we pass the floor to Professor André de Carvalho Ramos. Thank you, Barbara. I want to greet all of the colleagues in this virtual panel. I want to thank Professor Manuela, Ilan, and Professor Sandra Soares for the invitation. I always say that being invited by them is an honor for me. I'm always delighted to work with them. My speech is to analyze the discrepancies between the speech and the practice that characterize the current economic globalization process led by transnational companies and its implications to international migrations, specifically focused on Brazil in a recent context of economic crisis in recent years and in the era of a pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic. The main matrix of globalization is the economy, and was imposed by the practices and values of neoliberalism. The same globalization affecting global mobility, goods and services is reductionist and protectionism in terms of human mobility. Estimated data show that globalization, from the point of view of the so-called human international mobility, is completely disproportional in terms of the globalization of goods and services. The proportion of migrants in comparison to the total global population was 2.5% in 1960. Currently, it's around 3.5, 3.8%, depending on the source of data. Differently, the globalization of goods, services, and capitals is intense, generation and interdependency of the economies. Therefore, there are asymmetries in globalization. I bring a study from CEPAL, which is important. It's a new UN agency focused on Latin America, showing discrepancies between the speech and the practices of developed countries. It's not by chance that today one of the main lines of research that involves the so-called grammar of human rights is the line of equity. Piketty and Vici and other authors try to bring empirical data showing the absurd growth of inequality, not only between states, but also in terms of the social dimension, with a very severe situation of income concentration and the concentration of plutocracy, of global plutocracies. So bringing this about discussion, at least 7 negative consequences identified due to this globalization meant for a minority, the discrepancy between speech and practice on the part of developed countries that speak of economic opening of borders, but at the same time promoting protectionism practices. And of course, enjoying the differential development, the power of bargaining between developed and undeveloped states. The opening of the economies was one of the unmet promises, since development was not promoted and inequalities only grew as we can see in different countries. The issue involving the foreign debt, which is a long-term issue involving, including Brazil, the whole generation that is called the lost decade, is still a major problem for different countries, as we see, for example, in neighboring countries, surrounding Brazil. The high concentration of technology progress remains. The difference between value-added goods produced with technology and those who are to come from the agribusiness also remains, generating macroeconomic vulnerability for different countries that do not possess a diversified arsenal of technologies in their economies. Talking about migrations in the context of COVID-19 and the closing of borders, this has fueled xenophobic movements that keep the migrants as excluded elements of society, leaving aside any promise to create plurality, inclusion, and respect for the rights of everyone. We must say that the Convention of the UN, the so-called major conventions, where the one that has the lowest number of ratifications, the only treaty, the only convention of human rights that Brazil has not ratified among the 9 major treaties promoted by the UN, is the International Convention of Migrant Workers' Rights and their families. So this is the symbol of the failure of this vision, specifically after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the utopic vision of the positive consequences of the globalization. This is the symbol failure of this theory, creating what Ottaviani calls dystopic globalization. Hence, this feeling of frustration of the so-called globalization excluded elements, as we see through the Brexit and different movements where we have the denial of the democratic system, what Justice Barroso calls abusive constitutionalism and authoritarian legalism. Therefore, all contemporary studies on the liberal democracies and the risk brought by these frustrations generated by intense exclusion and concentration of income. As this globalization is strongly concentrationalist and strongly reductionist, the reality today is much closer to what Milanovici states that should not surprise us. This wave of globalization reinforces ties of subordination, exclusion, and violation of rights. So how should we deal with migration in this context of reductionist globalization, strongly focused on income concentration and increased exclusion? In the Latin American context and in terms of Brazil, interregional migration has been growing and intra-regional migration has been increasing as well, as we can see in this irregular flow of people from Venezuela to Brazil, and previously in the flow of people in vulnerability situations from Haiti. So Brazil is challenged to form a clear political position on migrations, taking into consideration the Brazilian national commitment to its own constitution, to the migration laws, and international commitment to the international human rights treaties and the Convention of 1951 of the Statute of Refugees,
which is turning 70. So in this moment of economic crisis, of pandemic, we can say that we have learned how not to do things. I gave a talk in Passo Fundo recently, And the lecture was, what have we learned from the pandemic? We have learned that it is necessary in these contexts of crisis, it's necessary to reinforce the protection of rights, the rights to inclusion, because vulnerability is enhanced. And in the case of migrations, Brazil did the opposite, shut off its borders, um, disregarded the historic principle of not refusing entry to refugees. The situation with the Venezuelans has completely changed now. We're expecting a decision about the border change from CONARI, the Council on Migrations, and this is a position that should never have been abandoned, which is the humanitarian entry. So we should turn our eyes to the preservation of rights. The logic of the migration law is inclusive, that it's not perfect. There was no agency. The specialists committee that I was a member of had suggested this, to have a public policy specialized in migrations, that at least in the absence of the agency, we can also conclude that we have advanced. So this memory of the migration question has to be preserved for future crises. So there's a tendency to use human movements in the context of hyper exploitation. It's not undocumented workers that generates hyper exploitation. It's hyper exploitation is what stimulates undocumented migration. So we have to deal with migration in terms of inclusion and preservation of rights, because with that we can establish a framework, a normative framework that can bring us closer to the ideal, which is the ideal of protection and what the Constitution and treaties seek to achieve. Inevitably, hyperexploitation generates asymmetries, internal asymmetries, tensions, this disbelief in democracy, has been happening in various parts in the world, including in Brazil. So in conclusion, I think I've already gone over my time. As Hosanna Hayes, my friend, Professor Hosanna Hayes, human societies move, regardless of this idea, these xenophobic positions about building walls. Societies move, and human rights should accompany societies on the move, especially in the economic, political, social, and environmental dimensions. So when we talk about this migratory phenomenon, we must understand what is behind. And what is behind this is that fighting hyperexploitation, using the grammar of human rights as a resource, we can eliminate this vicious cycle where migrations are a fuel to the growth of concentration, the creation of fortresses with xenophobic movements, which of course redound in even more exclusion and more global plutocrats. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Barbara, back to you. We are the ones who are grateful, Professor. It's great to hear you. It's my second time, so it's always great. Thank you for your talk. Remember, everyone, if you have questions or comments, use the Q&A function. And at the end, we'll open up for debate and you can ask a question orally if you so choose. So we're very pleased to invite our third guest, Ruth Marie Nicolin. She's the spokesperson of the Toledo Solidarity Embassy, and she is a language teacher, Portuguese and English. So welcome, Ruth. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to greet all the speakers. I'm very much honored to receive this opportunity to take part in this conversation. I was listening carefully. I think I was able to absorb a lot. I want to humbly, because we have this embassy and we service our immigrants who come to us. I'm very young, I'm still learning a lot. This Solidarity Embassy was created because of a need here in the city of Toledo, in the west of Paraná. And there are 15 nationalities, 8,000 migrants by the Solidarity Embassy. This is in south of Brazil. I'd like to talk about the question of immigrants as an experience. I'm Haitian. I've been in Brazil for 9 years. So when I talk about migration, to me, it's a life experience. It's quite emotional for me because it's my reality, is what I face. And we deal with people here that are going through the same situations. So I'd like to share with you things that you probably know. It's not a novelty, but it's what I have here to share with you. We know that immigrants have many reasons to migrate: educational, environmental, social, economic. But what we have suffered here is the invisibility of the immigrant. We like to talk generally, but I'd like to talk about immigrant women because this is what we have uh, most faced. We have here immigrant women who sometimes depends on the partner to survive because she doesn't have access to the health system, because there is the language barrier. This is something we are working with much love to help women to have independence and freedom to be able to do her things, to seek a job. And it's a small step because the task is huge, but there are not many of us. We're quite thinly spread. One of the hospitals here called Bom Jesus, or the public health system, call us to translate. So we're very happy to help, but at the same time, it's sad because the public system should have a support system to be able to translate for people, but in the end, they resort to us to be able to translate medical consultations. This is very sad because people suffer unnecessarily. They leave their countries with the idea that they'll have a better life, they'll be supported. I don't think that's only about Brazil. With the pandemic, we have a situation of migratory crisis. When arriving, for example, here in Brazil, the reality is completely different. Migrants are looked upon as people who are taking over jobs, who are taking over space. somebody who is uncomfortable, is inconvenient. It's not true, of course. We know that Brazil uh, exports more people than imports. We have 1.8 million immigrants in Brazil and 3 million Brazilians living abroad. And 1.8 million is less than 1% of the Brazilian population. These people do not feel supported, embraced when they arrive in Brazil. People leave their countries sometimes because of hunger or war. We have the situation of Haiti, which is living a chaotic moment. A lot of people are leaving the country for various reasons, but country is living through a political crisis, a civil crisis. Brazil uh, is a welcoming country, but the public bodies are not doing their homework because people do not have information, they don't have the support they need, because immigrants who come to us, they want us to, how shall I say, just to give them information, because there's no policy basically for immigrants. So immigrants don't know how to access the public health system, for instance. And if they do, then how is the access done? They don't know the rights. They sit in their corner. They don't know the rights they have here, where to resort to, who to resort to. It's very sad. We say that here, the question of violence, because owing to the invisibility, especially of the immigrant woman, um, there is a situation of violence against immigrant women, and that has been growing. It's sad when we talk about women become statistics because of the violence they undergo. At least here in my side of the city in Western Paraná, we don't enter the statistics because there's no record of the immigrant women. So we ask for help. I would like to have this and that. And the question, so often the reply we get from the authorities is, can you prove that these people are living here? So sadder than becoming a statistic is to not become a statistic. This is quite an emotional issue for me. It's very hard to do the work without support, especially the women who don't have the support they need. This is a sad fact. So I have here a letter to the world that was written by the president of the Solidarity Embassy. Edna Nunes is a journalist. She founded the embassy 5 years ago. So we created this letter to the world, to people all over the world, to sensitize them and to talk about the reality we are living through. This material will be shared with you on the platform for anyone who is curious and have access later on. So in this letter to the world, we start saying, have you ever wished to change the world? Did you wake up one day and wanted or needed to change the world, to make the world a better place for all, not just for you and your family, but for everyone around you? Make the world a better place. And so we're also going to work on how the embassy was created. It's a very exciting story, inspiring story. It's a long story, but so Edna saw the need, and Maeve, who's one of the volunteers that helps us put together the idea of the embassy. And we have faced many struggles regarding, migrants need to learn the language, to be able to find a job. We work on that. We do our jobs. We know that the private sector exploits this workforce. The immigrants are often young people with qualifications, but because they don't, because of the language barrier, they end up going to jobs in meat packing, for instance, which is the easiest, the easiest jobs to get. So these workers are very much exploited by the private sector, by the corporations. So there's the violence, there's the invisibility, and thank God lately there is a growth in entrepreneurship among immigrants. So we have workshops to encourage immigrants to um, open their own businesses and to realize their dreams. So we have a very beautiful example of Abidou, who is from Senegal, very talented man. He started making clothes with textiles from West Africa, and it was very well received. So the region absorbed very well this culture. The clothes are very beautiful. So we're now seeing Brazilians with the Senegalese clothing in the street. In the day-to-day lives, we see Brazilian women with turban. I'm Haitian, so I don't have that habit, but Abdul's clothes and turbans have gone down very well. With the demand, he has a store, he has the production, but with the pandemic, um, he's no longer here. But there's a lot of many stories to tell. But with the pandemic, there was a drop because we know that the reality is very different from what people say. Many Haitians tried to go to the United States and leave Brazil behind. And this, and here in our region, there was a need for, there's a labor shortage, and so they're valuing us a little bit more. I'm not going to mention the name of any corporations here, but there's one company that started investing. They realized that they were losing their workers. The foreign workers were leaving Brazil, so they started investing in training Portuguese language classes to help the immigrants want to be qualified quicker to be able to meet the labor demands. So we work as little ants because one day at a time, one step at a time. That's how we advance. I think the talks have been very significant, very deep, and I humbly offer you my experience here in the west of Paraná, in the south of Brazil. Thank you, Ruth. We're very grateful for your words, very strong words relating your experience, reporting your experience. You touched me very deeply. I think this idea of bringing together academia with lived experiences is very important. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. So, in this spirit, we invite our next speaker, who is Wilson Senatus. He's an engineering student in the Federal University of Paraná and executive director of the Professional and Students Haitian Association from Paraná. Thank you for joining us, Wilzort.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I have learned a lot from everyone's talks. And I've been in Brazil since 2015. In 2015, I graduated in the logistics course. In 2017, I entered university through the Primubi program. It's a program for migrants in Brazilian universities. When I joined the university, since 2015, I was trying to enter the university as a migrant, but I did not know if I would have access to university programs. Then I discovered that there was this policy created by international law professors that have struggled, that have fought to create this program, to open access to migrant students to higher education. When I joined in 2017, I saw the number of migrants that were in the university and that this was a very low number. So this program had started in 2014 and we created an association to try to boost this number of migrants that were studying in university, to open access to more people in our community. So from 2017 to 2018, we were able to motivate like a whole group of migrants, showing them that with an additional effort, they could join the university to improve their educational profile. So we created a partnership with the Department of International Law, and also a partnership with the Department of Humanities. We also created classes for Haitian language, Haitian history. We established a partnership also with the incubator inside the university to promote graduate studies for the migrant community inside the university, focus on a solidarity economy. So we try to we establish those partnerships because this is an element that will create big changes in our community, in the integration with the Brazilian society. It's a form of integration. So still in this topic, as migrants who live in Brazil, sometimes we don't know which path we should follow. Sometimes when we need things and we go to institutions, they sometimes, we are denied the information that we need. Sometimes health professionals, for example, that work for the public health system, as they see that we are migrants, when they see that we are migrants, they treat us differently. So speaking of migration, the migrations in Brazil until 2017, well, I had access to a report saying that in 2010 there was there were not even 20 Haitians in Brazil. After 2014 and the earthquake, we a high number of migrants from Haiti were received in Brazil. It's a new term for UN, what we call environmental refugees. So Haitians, it is as we are included in this group. These are people that were forced to leave their home cities due to natural disasters, volcanoes and eruptions, other natural disasters. So the distribution of these migrations in Brazil until 2017, 73% of the refugees in Brazil, 73% were due to environmental disasters. When we talk about migration, it's not only a matter of migration, but also not only people that leave their countries to live in other countries, but also people that are displaced inside Brazil as well. So the 73% of migrants due to environmental causes, including Haitians, we have a little bit more than 1 million people that migrate due to violence as well. This is what has been happening recently in Haiti. And also, more than 1 million people that had to migrate due to lack of development. People that are looking for better livelihoods, better living conditions. So the human rights that are declared by international treaties, such as the Declaration of Human Rights and Civil Pacts of Political Rights, and in migration, we have the concept of a refuge. The person leaves from their hometown, sometimes due to natural disasters, or due to conflict, for example. This is what we call economic refuge. Me, as one of the persons responsible for the association, we work with these migrants. We see their situations in the labor market, for example, or in society. When we talk about companies, for example, the issue of housing, if a migrant wants to rent a house, for example, companies know that they will treat migrants in a different way. Sometimes they don't have documents. So the contract that is signed with the migrant is different. In the workplace as well, the treatment given to migrants is different. The contracts are different. Economic rights as well, regardless of the size of the company. So universities, for example, should offer their services respecting the rights of all. Companies should treat all of their employees with respect. There are social cultural gains with these integrations. In Brazil, companies usually does not respect workers' basic rights, and migrants suffer even more with this kind of practice. Because first, they do not speak the language, they don't have papers, usually they don't have all due documentation. Sometimes migrants are forced to work without proper compensation and without a right to rest leaves. So we see cases of migrants working under irregular conditions. There are companies that have the preference to employ migrants because they can manipulate these people. Sometimes these people are forced to leave their homes here in Brazil to work in other places inside Brazil as well. There's an example. A company called me saying that they need a number of different migrants to work in other cities. Sometimes they don't respect even the basic requirements of a proper employment. In terms of businesses and human rights, the companies, they can impact individuals. The public power should regulate the corporation so that they respected people's rights, be them nationals or Brazilians, Brazilian national citizens, or migrants. Human rights belong to all and to each one of us. So, for example, the Brazilian Criminal Code, Article 149, that bans forced work or work similar to slavery. I have seen migrants having to sign just cause termination notices without any reason, without any justification. And the interest of the employer was just not to pay severance pay. So companies should support and respect the protection of internationally recognized human rights. Brazil is a signatory of international treaties. Companies should support diversity in companies. They should respect the right to collective bargaining. But they want to hire migrants without considering the elimination, for example, of all forms of forced labor. In 2018, the presidential decree number 9571 was approved on November 21, 1995, creating the national guidelines for human rights in companies. This decree is based on the guiding principles published by the UN, dealing with the corporate responsibilities in terms of respect to human rights. And in Article 7 provides that companies should guarantee respect to human rights, the proper compensation, but globally speaking, sometimes corporations grow more than the power of states. They use migrant work in an irregular way. Contracts with migrants do not comply with corporate law. So we must build up on the guarantee to human rights, promotion of decent work, do proper corporate practices, public policies, and government actions with the goal of valuing diversity regardless of social, ethnical origin, to fight against disguised slave work, giving the same opportunities to all. So I want to thank you once again for the opportunity. We thank you very much. I'm sorry, can you hear me? I have a problem with my microphone. Yes, we can hear you. So Wilzert, we thank you for your words. We thank you also for hearing about your experience. This is something very enriching for our panel. And now I want to invite our next speaker, who is José Luis Gutiérrez Aranda. Since 2012, he's responsible for policies related to natural resources and trade in Africa Eurofaith network in Brussels. Previously, he was responsible for live volunteer work promoting interculturalism and integration of migrants in Spain. He has worked as a migration attorney for 1 decade, has researched on the right of family reunification of undocumented migrants in the European Union. Currently, he is member of the global campaign to disassemble the corporate power and do away with impunity. Gisele is a master in law from University of Sevilla in Spain, and a moral theology, University of Leuven, Belgium. Also a Bachelor of Philosophy from University of Comillas in Spain. So it's an honor and a pleasure that we invite our last speaker, Professor Aranda, and then we'll start the Q&A session. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for the introductions. Thank you also, Roman, for giving me the opportunity to speak of this reality of forced migrations from a little bit different position that we heard in the previous talks, but more focused on the African continent. So usually we don't hear about the drama and through caravans of migrants going nowhere and refugee camps. Sometimes the media forget that forced migrations are originated in the desks of in the offices of people that are responsible for financial policies, economic policies in developed country. We want to talk about migration originated in Africa, ending up in the expulsion of millions of people from their home communities, trying to challenge the causes of migrations of millions of people. We first have to analyze the free trade agreement between Africa and Europe. And for some years, we also try to analyze the behavior of large European corporations in Africa. To that, I want to start my speech with a very significant data. This data can show us why Africa has become the object of desire for richer companies. With that, they are forcing millions of people to migrate from their hometowns. Well, in the first place, I start by this very general data. The African continent has 1/3 of mineral reserves of the planet. Under the ground in Africa, more than 40% of the gold reserves are hidden, 55% of diamond reserves, 65% of cobalt reserves, and around 80% of platinum reserves. If we talk about arable lands, fertile lands, these numbers skyrocket. According to Fidelity, only 10% of the 400 million hectares of cultivated arable lands are planted today. Commercial terms, Africa generates 700 tons of products per year and has at least half of the arable land in the planet. In terms of population, we have a young continent with more than 1,200,000,000 people. And according to some estimates, in 2050, this will be almost 2 billion people, half of which will have less than 25 years of age. This makes Africa a continent with a huge consumption potential, allowing the expansion to all the other major economies in the world. Given these figures, we have the capitalistic thinking that immediately tries to establish investments so that they and considering to perpetuate the poverty, of course, without considering the rights of local communities, indigenous peoples. And when capitalist logics come in, the goal is to do away with family agriculture, subsistence agriculture, which accounts for 85% of the properties in Africa, creating infrastructure such as bridges, highways, airports, as if these thinkers had forgotten that in these territories they have people, families, languages, and cultures still living. These people deserve to live with dignity. In terms of the concept of forced migration, the International Organization for Migrations identified forced migrations as the migratory movement produced by a number of involuntary circumstances, such as escape from persecution, conflict, repression, or natural disasters, be them provoked by men, by the environmental degradation, or other situations that put these people's existence in danger. We have three categories of forced migrations: those that are caused by conflicts, by economic development, and the ones caused by natural disasters. I'm going to focus on the second type, forced migrations caused by economic development, making these realities produced by deterioration by large companies.
So not just responsibility from the investing countries, but there's major responsibility on the part of the countries where the violations of the human rights take part. Forced migrations caused by corporations or mega projects lead us to think naively that they are produced in favor of economic development. So creation of mega dams or highways or airports. But forced migrations caused by corporations are not because of mega projects, but in many cases they are produced because of extractive industries, oil or minerals, or agricultural corporations that take over the living space of a certain population. So, so people are compelled to move, to leave their homes. These are used that are prolonged over time and end up deteriorating the living conditions of the population. The flight is often the result of the uh, is, is is because people resist, and often it's because of the destruction of the survival infrastructure, economic infrastructure. So these forced displacements um, in the how is that compatible with the promise of the investments to improve lives? So I want to present some of the economic dynamics, um, political, environmental, that bring about these forced migrations in Africa. Africa is crisscrossed by a multitude of multilateral agreements. These international agreements establish themselves at regional, continental, and intercontinental level. These cooperation agreements lay the foundations for the economic agreements, and so the main factor favoring the arrival of corporations in Africa and the construction of infrastructures derive from these international political agreements, which facilitate foreign direct investment, both for corporations as well as the possibility to operate without accountability, with fiscal tax breaks and other facilities, and impunity when it comes to immunity when it comes to executing these projects. So The most relevant agreements are within uh, Southern, Central, and Western Africa. These political agreements uh, are the underpinning for sectoral and economic agreements, including the customs unions and even monetary policies. So now they're a negotiation of an Africa-wide free trade agreement. It's a trade agreement between 44 countries of the African Union, and it would be the biggest free trade zone in the world, a single market that would permit the free circulation of people and also a monetary union. This treaty reproduces all the main inconvenience for the population and for development, as do the agreements with the developed countries. For example, the reduction of tariffs, which would favor the more industrialized African countries over the rest, and lead to the worsening of public policies and open the door to privatization of public corporations. So one must highlight the Cotonou Agreement between the European Union and the African Union, which over the last decade has facilitated the establishment of major European corporations on the continent, which has led in many cases to forced migrations. This political agreement is based on three pillars: strengthening of democratic project and economic, trade, and development cooperation. The pillars 1 and 2 are excuses to get to the true interests of the European Union, which are the commercial and economic treaties which facilitate for European corporations the access to the raw materials and the consumption markets without having to pay any form of tariff. This practice condemns African states to pauperization and deteriorates public services and forces indigenous industries to lower their standards. There are many other bilateral agreements that have a single purpose, which is the economic purpose, like United States, China, Japan, or Canada. All these bilateral trade agreements hark back to the 80s when the World Bank imposed on Africa the structural adjustment plan that demanded a series of infrastructures that could guarantee the fluidity of the loans granted. These millions of displaced people by development has continued. People are experiencing extreme poverty. Very often, migration is the only way out. So we must talk about also land grabs, which is the last stage of this absurd practices. Because of the increase in raw material prices, to avoid shortages in the rich countries, the increase in land grabs have to do with speculative purposes and also with biofuels. So the environmental and social consequences of the land grabs has brought about the lack of fertile lands for small peasant farmers, and also the end of many common lands, common properties, in favor of monoculture plantations. So in 2006, there was created by the FAO the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa. So it was created by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates. AGRA says that they support sustainable development, nutrition, poverty reduction, adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Good words, but failed to achieve any of the objectives. So all these projects were funded by billions of dollars through international bodies like the World Bank. This institution, AGRA, do not pay attention to how these loans are affecting small farmers. So they do not monitor the impacts of their loans. They just are concerned about farmers acquiring seeds and agrochemicals and fertilizers and other inputs from the private sector. So imagine this. Imagine a small group of peasant farmers who borrow money to invest in GM seeds that must be accompanied by chemical inputs that make people abandon their traditional crops. So these practices have been ruinous. So AGRA has done its best to influence governments in Africa in favor of corporations for fertilizers, agrochemicals, and seeds. So when farmers face difficulties in paying back their loans, they have to abandon agriculture. Often these seeds are completely incompatible with their traditional farming practices, and that's when the agricultural corporations arrive and take over the land. So firstly, in conclusion, I want to say that these realities that I've described are all about the race for Africa's natural wealth. So why are corporations from all over the world wanting to position themselves in Africa? Not just raw material companies, energy, technological companies, extractive or agricultural. The major corporations, transnational corporations, for decades have been setting up shop in Africa, are completely continuing the plunder of Africa while the population continues to suffer. It's a new colonialism, but now sponsored by corporations. It is not done by the states. It's conducted by corporations, grounded on trade agreements. He has muted himself by mistake.
José Luiz, desculpe interromper, o seu áudio não está funcionando, nós não conseguimos
You've
te ouvir.
muted yourself by mistake, José Luis.
O seu áudio foi mutado acidentalmente.
Oh, here we go.
Em 20 segundos ainda, no final, que nós paramos de te ouvir.
So it's only the last 20 seconds. So I just want to conclude. So these realities that I've described are about the race for Africa's resources. Second place, we are facing a new colonialism, which is no longer sponsored by states, by countries, but rather by transnational corporations from the same countries. The circumstances lead us to have new waves of forced migrations. The arrival of COVID, although we don't have very good figures, this has put the brakes on, to a certain extent, on migration. So it's the first time in 25 years that the African economic growth has dropped. This is probably going to be temporary, but this has led 40 million Africans to join the ranks of the extremely poor. So the problems of economic policy coherence have to do with the international political and economic treaties, which are the framework for these policies. So unless there is a good governance and a fight against corruption in the countries where there are human rights violations, and we continue to have the impunity of major corporations, the situation will only worsen. So these forced and desperate migrations will continue to exist. The number of immigrants keeps growing. No human being should be forced to seek refuge in another country, and certainly no one does this out of spite. So migrations of these people presume that countries are being drained of qualified personnel. So we can account those that emigrate specifically because of infrastructural works, but all of those that leave their communities because of a deterioration of living conditions. So what are the political mechanisms that could control the transnational corporations? They are so far insufficient to protect, like the OECD guidelines and and other instruments are continued to be voluntary regulations. And so forced migrations continue. So there is a need for an extraterritorial international law to be able to prosecute the human rights violations by corporations. So I consider it urgent to protect the human rights defenders. So very often persecution is what leads to immigration. Those that stand up for their rights face persecution, forgive me. So there is a need to recognize the community's rights as such and their participation in the decision-making about major projects on their territories. We cannot forget the voices of the legitimate owners of the land. They have the right to say no to this supposed development that despoils their land. And in any case, there should be fair compensation for people to have a dignified existence if they have been forced to migrate. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am at your disposal for the debate. Okay, we are the ones that thank you. Thank you very much, José Luis, for your forceful words. Thank you very much for our debate. We do have some time still for the debate. So firstly, I want to say thank you once again to all our guests. So I want to raise a few points to debate. Some questions are aimed at a particular speaker, others are more general, so feel free to comment. Just tailor your comments to whichever questions you find most relevant or most interesting to you. So we have here a question for Ruth. So it's a direct question. If the Solidarity Embassy accepts donations, I don't see.
E seria possível postar os dados
So
no
if you
chat
want to
aqui do
put
lado
the
de como a pessoa
banking
pode fazer essa
information
doação
on the chat,
para
how
deixar
people can make the
disponibilizado
donation,
para você poder
that would be
colocar.
much appreciated.
Sim, com certeza. A gente aceita todo tipo de
We
doações
accept
possíveis.
all kinds of
E
donations.
ali na cartilha que eu disponibilizei ali, na
In
última página
the
tem o
last page of the
Instagram, o
booklet,
Facebook e as informações ali sobre
there's
a agenda
our
solidária.
Instagram, our
Então, se
Facebook
você
pages
qualquer
where
coisa, é só
it says where you can donate.
Obrigada.
Thank
Nós
you.
temos aqui duas perguntas
So
gerais.
we
Eu vou
have
começar por essa
general
e depois a
questions,
gente
and
vai para
then
as que são mais
we
direcionadas.
go more
Tem aqui uma
to the more
pergunta
specific
do
ones.
Juan Fernandes Machado.
There's one
Diante do
to
aumento
Juan
da
Fernandez Machado.
xenofobia em
With the
países com
increase
história
in
de
xenophobia
imigração,
in
as
countries
visões
with a history of
otimistas
uh,
segundo as quais a
uh,
xenofobia tende a retroceder
migration, the
quando o
optimistic
contato se dá
views
entre os grupos
that
migratórios e as populações
xenophobia
locais
tends to
ainda
decrease with the
possuem
contact between
validade?
immigrants
Visões
and
otimistas?
the
Essa pergunta
the
ficaria
host
para
country population. Is that
aquele
still valid that with
presidente
integration the xenophobia
determinado
will
discutir. E uma
decrease?
segunda pergunta
And the
geral, vou
second
fazer essa
question,
pergunta
another
e aí a
general
gente
question, and then people
evita o
can
debate. A segunda pergunta geral é,
reply as they wish
professora Manuela,
from Professor Manuela.
depois
So I'd
de
like
usar a
to
aprovação
know
da
if
nova lei
after the
de
approval of the new law of
imigração,
immigration in
existe a
2017,
percepção de
is
alguma
there the
mudança
perception of
efetiva no
any
tratamento dos
objective
migrantes pelas
change in the
instituições do Estado
treatment
brasileiro
of
e
immigrants by
nos
the institutions of the
migrantes
state?
que
Or
contribuiriam nesse
maybe
processo? Então,
has
são duas
the
perguntas
political
gerais
moment
para
we're
os convidados.
experiencing, did
Então, queria
that
pedir àqueles que se sentirem à vontade, né,
affect
que possam abrir o
negatively
microfone
the
e dar resposta
implementation
às perguntas
of the
iniciais. Então, a gente
2017
passa para aquelas perguntas
immigration
iniciais.
law, and then we'll go to the replies.
Bárbara, posso começar?
Well, I can start.
Tá me ouvindo?
Can you hear me?
Sim, eu fechei para não dar eco o microfone.
Yes.
Tá ouvindo?
I,
Não, obrigado. É sempre bom
please
checar antes.
feel free to
Bom,
answer.
eu vou me dedicar mais à segunda pergunta.
Well, I'm going to focus more on the second question from Professor Manuela about
Em primeiro lugar, a professora Manuela já
the new situation that we're living. Professor Manuela has already addressed the exceptional circumstances that we have seen in these last 2 years. So the migration law
adotada em momento
was adopted
de modificação
in a moment when
do governo brasileiro, mas
we had a change in the
diria até que raro.
context of the Brazilian administration, but in a rare moment that we were living in Brazil of a multi-partisan moment. But the law that was obtained in this multi-partisan context did not complete the transformation cycle that was imagined for the treatment of migrations in Brazil. So there were advancements, of course, in the statute of migrants, but the part that, from my point of view, was indispensable, the reformulation of public policies, was not addressed by this law. There's a generic provision for the need of coordination, specifically due to the fragmentation of this treatment, both at the municipal, state, and national level. Although this is typically a federal topic, the federal government should lead this process. The national agency was not created. So we have an administrative situation that is still fragmented, and we will still need further development. What we already know in the area of human rights, the evolution of standards without the evolution of institutions may frustrate the ultimate goals of the initiative. So we still have different ministries dealing with the situation. We have the National Council of Migration. We have an important administrative role of the federal police in Brazil. I reinforced that the draft in the experts committee had eliminated the actions of the federal police from in the area of migration, so the federal police can also dedicate their efforts as the judiciary police for the federal government. So we still have the fragmentation, the so-called patch policy. So whenever we have a crisis, there is some form of action. As we've seen in the case of Afghans and other crises that we had from as migrants from Venezuela. So I'd see that the advances that we have seen still deserve institutional monitoring. But this normative advancements were perceived by the judiciary branch. The next topic of a discussion on migrations is this strategic litigation on migrations of how will we use the judiciary power to as an indispensable support. So recently in the Brazilian courts, there was a resolution, September 2021, encouraging judges to take treaties in consideration to adopt decisions whose initial fundament are the treaties, putting into check the decrease of closing of borders. So in this sense, this decision has been encouraging more judiciary decision than institutionalized framework as we have imagined previously. Thank you, Professor André. Does any of the speakers wish also to speak on the first question, the increase of the optimistic view in which xenophobia tends to decrease, or and I take the opportunity to also add another question, because one question ends up adding to each other, and we can have a broader debate.
Bom, aqui então temos uma pergunta. Essa pergunta está direcionada para o José Luiz.
This question directed to José Luis from Andressa. How did the dynamic of COVID has changed the situation of migrants in Europe? And this question may lead to other elements as well. So I asked this question. And from Professor Manuela Roland, I want to ask Juan Subizaret and Juan Luis if the topic of migrations is included in the international agenda of human rights and businesses, if it's treated in national action plans and legislation, in due diligences, and what is your opinion on that? Thank you for the questions. In the theme of xenophobia, I am not optimistic, for sure. Xenophobia continues to increase, and I think that there is a trend to have even more xenophobia. I think that on the theme of poverty, I think that we have a lot of prejudice against poor migrations, this poverty that is associated to migrations. And also we have racism. So we have prejudice against poverty, racism, and also xenophobia. In terms of what happens in Africa, we have a more specific vision, different than what we have in Europe. We don't have data about the situation of COVID in Africa. It's a mystery. There is no reliable data. Certainly, the pandemic is also in Africa. It's leading to deaths, to collateral effects in the population, but we don't have data as we have in Europe. This also is a reason of concern to us because we cannot act. Likewise, in the topic of vaccines. So, are there mechanisms to make promote vaccination in Africa as we are having in developed countries? Are the vaccines enough? So there is a resistance in terms of vaccination in Africa. And also, how corporations have been behaving in Africa during the period of social isolation in the world. Major corporations have accelerated the exploitation of natural resources in Africa during the pandemic. They continue to exploit natural resources. There was less control due to the restrictions of movements and traveling during the pandemic, and with that, they continue. Major corporations had even greater impunity. In the cases where we were able to monitor, we saw that companies, they were publicly stating that they were being economically affected, that there was no labor force, that they had problems to allow their products to circulate. But the information that we have from our local organizations is that the economic activity continued as usual. And they also benefited from different opportunities. There were cases in which that they took opportunities not to renew contracts, but we don't have objective data to be able to say or to offer figures about that. But certainly they went on with their businesses during the pandemic. About the topic of the international agenda, of course, that the international agenda and in the topic of migrations, what they do is that they are simply offering data of dams, of forced displacement, but there is no attempt to take protective measures, juridical measures on the side of the European Union. In terms of the European Union, we are getting further and further away from human rights. For example, the European Union support Turkey and Morocco, where there are clear violations of human rights. So the international agenda does not defend forced migrants. This is the first. This is very evident for us. When we speak of economic conditions, the elites and governments do not want to incorporate forced migrations to the neoliberal racist economic model, which is the model that dominates capitalism at this moment. So they don't mix international agendas. They are completely separated, because accepting the unification of these agendas would be to recognize that transnational companies, as Jose Luis told us, of the export contracts and the cooperation for development is a cooperation condition to the control of migrations. This is the same as recognizes that the economic model is completely unfair. It's a colonial model. This is a strong contradiction. That's why they will continue to keep these agendas apart. I'm not a specialist, but the far right I know that what happens in terms of the rights of migrants, this is not dealt with in the field of human rights, but rather in the electoral field. So the far right continues to criminalize people that escape from extreme poverty. The far right criminalizes these people and they are simply against them. So this electoral logic defended by the far right and also by the center right. So we think we need that workers with temporary contracts or fixed contracts or even informal workers, they eh, they see migrants as their enemies. It's a war among the poor, and what different sectors of society are doing, they are provoking, instead of the defense of rights, they are allowing for an increase of the far right. So we need to experience, we must create places of meeting out of the state, the we need to institutionalize these efforts. We that are, uh, we must establish relationships among us. There's relationships that are will certainly not be created by the far right administrations and governments. Thank you, everyone. We are here trying to absorb everything. There are still two questions. Maybe Andrea can help us. One from Andressa. What specific points in the agenda of human rights and businesses and the regulation of transnational companies where they can influence in the migration crisis? And a second question from Wilson.
Então, ele pergunta se imigrante pode participar de atos sociais, mas uma vez
The question is if a migrant can participate of social acts and if the social acts are transformed into political acts. Will the new law guarantee the participation, their participation?
Então seriam duas questões aí.
So this would be the two questions.
Então, obrigado pelas perguntas.
Thank you for your question. About Andressa's questions on human rights and transnational companies, if they can, this can have a direct impact on the migration crisis. From the general point of view, I believe that migrants that are included, that have their rights attacked, and where we have this corporate power, they will benefit from this agenda. For me, of course, that there's a erosion of the state regulatory power. We need stronger influence in the defense of human rights. Specifically undocumented migrants, because migrations, of course, it's a plural question. We have different segments of society that do not face the traditional problems of migrations, but we have a number of undocumented migrants that have they're affected, that have an increased vulnerability. And the north of my research, the main point of my research is not exactly to show that this lack of documentation increases vulnerability, but to cause this vulnerability, this lack of documentation, this undocumented workers are essential to create this vulnerability. So the need of documentation, which is indispensable for the rights of all included, the needs to have basic rights to look for employment, which is something that was proposed by the committee of experts.
So we want there to be a migratory regular. We don't want the tradition, which is an amnesty every 10 years. So like a band-aid solution, rather than having a regular solution. It's much better to regularize documentation for immigrants to avoid this need for every 10 years to have an amnesty. So we have to have policies to welcome immigrants. So we have, for example, hiring policies for the disabled and other vulnerable populations. So why not have similar policies for immigrant workers? To avoid these hyper-exploitation, the modern forms of slavery, there's a film called Seven Prisoners, a Brazilian film that shows the situation of undocumented workers, the modern day slavery, bringing together these facets for us to have the benefits of the agenda of human rights and corporations for the immigrants. So regarding the social and political participation of immigrants, there are a number of restrictions in the old law, restrictions that were incompatible with the 1988 constitution. They were eliminated by the new law of 2017. So there is no restriction to take part in social and political activities. There has been no advance to the point of granting political rights in the strict sense, the right to vote, for example, but the right to gather, the right to information, the right to associate, freedom of expression. All these are absolutely in short by the treaties, by the 2017 law, by the Brazilian constitution. So what generates a sort of a deterrent effect, an inhibition, is if the person is undocumented. So yes, that does act as a deterrent effect, not just in Brazil, of course. So Wilzort, you have your hand up. Do you want to complement? Do you have any doubt? We can't hear you, Wilzort. Okay. Regarding what the professor said, the new law, the 2017 law, I've met lawyers from some movements that are demanding. There are Haitian immigrants living in a squat in Curitiba. I went there to get to know the place. I was able to help a lot of immigrants to get their papers in order, but the lawyer of this movement that is in this occupation is saying that they have to go to the rallies. We in the university, we try to talk to the professors in the law department to see if it's possible. But in our view, we imagine, because we don't have the right to vote, it's difficult to ask an immigrant who doesn't have the right to vote to say down with the government. So if we have the right to vote, then we would feel more at liberty to call for the downfall of the government. This is so you can only become a voter in Brazil, you have to naturalize yourself Brazilian. So the country is practically, our country, Haiti, is practically shut down, but they're going to become naturalized Brazilian. You need to have a negative an empty criminal record. In other words, a no criminal record back in Haiti. And right now it's impossible to get that documentation out of the country because the state has completely crumbled in Haiti. So anyway, that's that's the situation that we faced with these squatters in Curitiba, which is the state capital. Just to say that here in Brazil, there are two different normative realities. I understand your position. It's a defensible position. In Brazil, political rights in the strict sense would require a constitutional change. There was a proposal to change the constitution by Senator Aloysio Nunes for foreign residents to take part in municipal elections, which happens in the European Union. But that constitutional amendment did not go ahead. But to raise your voice in a critical way, to express yourself in a rally, in a demonstration, and even under the previous law, when there were these clear when there were these clear guidelines saying that you couldn't create associations, you could not take part in political activities, back then already case law was already saying no, that the courts were saying no, that the constitution allowed foreign residents to express themselves politically. So I respect your position to say that if you can't vote, you don't want to call for the downfall of the government. But right now, what I want to tell you is that the fact that you don't have the right to vote does not preclude you from manifesting publicly your political criticism. I was an electoral prosecutor. I stayed 6 years working only with electoral law. There has been some discussion about this in the past, and the precedents have always separated the two things. Even though you don't have the right to vote, yes, you have the right to create an association, you have the right to have political positions. So I think it's a personal decision. You should demonstrate politically if you want. And of course, I am presupposing autonomy. There's no compulsion. Nobody can be forced to go on a demonstration, of course. There's a freedom to demonstrate. There's a freedom of expression, a freedom, but you're not forced to criticize anything or anyone. So the right to not express a political opinion is also protected. So people have their individual autonomy, of course.
Com certeza,
Thank you,
né,
Professor.
nós fomos provocados aqui com as falas e com as perguntas também, mas a gente vai precisar encerrar agora.
Unfortunately, we have to close.
Já aqui no Brasil, meio-dia 15.
In Brazil, it's 12:15 and we need to close. So I want to thank you
Vou escutar depois de novo. Eu tava
sincerely.
tudo fica gravado, né? Depois
Everything is recorded here, then we are going to post it in our channels. If you want, you have the opportunity to reflect once again. Personally, I give you my testimonial. I am from comparative literature, cultural studies, and when I look at this from a different point of view, it's a very enriching opportunity and makes dialogue even more interesting. So I want to thank you once again. For me, it's the second time with some of you. It's the first time with others. I thank Professor Manuela for the dedication, for the opportunity. Also, I think the opportunity to thank the translators, knowing of the difficulty, the challenge, which is to translate these speeches. I think all the participants, now we have 49 participants, but there was a moment when we reached 69 people watching. So I want to thank each one of the guest speakers for bringing their knowledge, sharing their information with us. So I want to close this session. Wish you a wonderful week, a wonderful holiday season. So see you next time. I hope we meet very soon again. Thank you.
Prazer revê-los e revê-las.
It's a pleasure to see you all again.
Até mais.